Hey gang, we are in Woodbine, Illinois today. We're at the far northwest tip of Illinois. And it wasn't but just over a year ago that I was here doing a story on where they dumped the body, actually less than a mile away from here, of little Maria Ridolph, who was killed in Sycamore, still an open case. But we're here today, a very interesting hidden cemetery. And I think it's down this little road here, this little gravel road. Let's see what's up here. Welch Hollow Cemetery. We just came down Welch Road, and we're looking for this little tiny cemetery in the hollow here. And it is said that there is the grave of a man who was a sorcerer back in the 1800s. Yeah, there's a cemetery right up here. Look at that. Way up here at the top of the hill, hidden. Very interesting. Well, we're going to go check it out, that's for sure. And we're going to see if we can find the grave of a warlock. I want to thank Elizabeth Austin, who is one of our viewers, for suggesting we come to this location. It was quite a long drive, a very cold day. It's Black Friday, Thanksgiving. Perfect day to take a little walk. It's a very small cemetery. And we're going to talk a little bit of history of witchcraft and the black magic, the black arts, the black spells. We'll go back to a very long time ago, actually before Christ. I'm going to tell you a few stories as we walk along here, and we're going to end up at the grave. Well, I do know, I haven't been up there, but I know it is at the far northwest corner of this little tiny cemetery, only because it was described that way, and I went on Google Earth. If you go on Google Earth, you can actually see it. So let's walk there for the first time together and see what we see. Come on along. Let's take the walk. Let's see if the gate is open. I think it is. Well, it looks like a mix of very old stones and some new stones. Let's have a look here. Let's actually start out with this stone. That is the stone that is anchoring the far southeast corner. And yeah, as I was saying, by the way, it was actually up there, if you look way up there, that is where the body of Maria Ridolph was found in 1958. I'll put the link up for that one. This is Evan Evans, who was born in 1835. Jeanette wife of Evan Evans. So he died in 1915, and she had preceded him in death, it looks like. Jeanette, wife of Evan Evans, 1849 to 1905, at 56 years old. Interesting. So yeah, the practice of witchcraft, and one thing I'll tell you is it's kind of synonymous, the terms witchcraft, sorcerer, and a warlock. Of course, a warlock is a male witch. And this goes back to, well, the first recorded time of this was before Christ, 300 years before Christ. I mean, if we go way back, the first recorded witch was, she lived in Athens, Greece. Theoris of Lemnos. Theoris was apparently some kind of magic practitioner, and her incantations, even after her death, were claimed to cure diseases or conditions like epilepsy, it is said. And back in Athens, using magic, back in that day even, it was not criminal. You could do it. It wasn't against the law, but they would start using potions, and the potions would move on to drugs that would kill people. And this would become common later, and that, of course, was against the law. And she was charged with intentional homicide by poisoning. So at some point between, around, they say, 323 BC, she was tried and executed. And she wasn't just executed herself, but her children were killed with her. Of course, it was a brutal time. You can only imagine what it was like back then. These accusations were not always just, even in more modern times. Let's go to Scotland. Let's talk about a story in Scotland. This was back in the 16th century. There was a family named the Douglases. Janet Douglas, otherwise known as Lady Glamis, she was a Scottish noblewoman, and she was accused of witchcraft. And it was during the reign of James V of Scotland. It's an interesting story that the Douglas family was not in all favored by the king. Well, why? Because Janet's brother, Archibald Douglas, 6th Earl of Angus, he was the king's stepfather, actually, and it was Angus who had earlier imprisoned young James. So he had a lot of resentment, and I guess that would make him also hate the woman, I guess you could call it his step-aunt, Jeanette, and his hatred for her was probably the worst of all. And when he gained his power, it was in December of 1528, and he had broken free of the Douglas family and inherited all his full power. That is when he had Jeanette summoned before him for treason. And of course they used the witchcraft. Well, James had accused Janet of witchcraft. It was clear that the accusations were false, and she was imprisoned with her husband in a dungeon of Edinburgh Castle. Deep in the dungeons, the cold dungeons. James did make his escape, but he was later killed. Now, it was easy for James to imprison Jeanette, but convicting her was much more difficult. To gain evidence, he had to get the family members and servants and subject them to torture. And of course, they all capitulated and said, yeah, she was a witch. So, not surprisingly, she was convicted, burned at the stake, July 15th, 1537, right near the castle in Edinburgh. And her young son was forced to watch her execution as she screamed from the burning stake. Agony finally faded away as the flames consumed her. It was in the same 16th century, not long after that, we can go across the channel and go to Sweden. Another story, there are many stories. A woman named Lasses Birgitta, she was a Swedish witch, and she was convicted of sorcery. It was in April of 1550 where she just went and confessed. She confessed to the bailiff and the secretary. Kalmar Castle. She had said that she had tried to awaken a dead man that was in the cemetery there at midnight. It was one night where she and two men had entered the churchyard with the intent of awakening one of the dead by magic. She had passed the place in a circle 3 times, and then she blew through this keyhole, the keyhole of the church, until, according to the records, it opened. Her magic was working. She had tried to get a hold of the priest's stole. That's what he wears around his neck. Even today, she couldn't find it. So she left and she tried again. And after another attempt, she found it. She got it, and she stole it. On her way out, she passed the church 3 times against the sun. She renounced God and swore herself to the devil. So the court judged her to be guilty of sorcery and sentenced her to death. How? By decapitation. Interestingly, the men who accompanied her were fined and released. Let's go next to the 17th century. Let's move on. Let's go to a story of a warlock in France. A very interesting story of a man, he was a priest actually, Urbain Grandier. He was a French Catholic priest, and he was involved in a lot of stuff. He was involved in these events they called the Loudun possessions. And it was in 1632 that a group of nuns got against him. They ganged up on him. Well, as the story goes, the local convent accused him of being a warlock and bewitching them, sending a demon called Asmande. Now, Asmande, sometimes in the form of a multi-headed figured beast, is one of the princes of the devil. They said that he was sent by Urbain to commit evil and imprudent acts with them. Now, these accusations began after he had refused to become the spiritual director of the convent. You see, he was unaware that the Mother Superior there, Giselle, she had a crush on him. She really liked his, she was kind of observing him from afar. And she was fascinated with him. In fact, the other nuns had gradually began to make similar accusations under her leadership, if you will. She was gathering them all together. She was enraged by his rejection, as she had heard of his sexual exploits, apparently. And she is the one who accused Grandier of the black magic, and she said he tried to seduce me. Of course, she was lying. So the first step was to try to exorcise him, And they tried multiple exorcisms. It didn't work. And he would not confess either. It was not made clear whether he wrote or signed this pact that they found. It was a pact with the devil. It is said that it may have been forged, it may have been made up, but they found it. So the judges who condemned him ordered that he be put to the extraordinary question, which is a form of torture, which was unusually, but not immediately, fatal. And boy, things could be gruesome in those times. What he was subjected to was what was called, in a form, the Spanish boot. The Spanish boot was an iron vise filled with spikes that was brought to a glowing red-hot level and then applied to his calf and ankle to shatter the bones. And despite that torture, Grandier never confessed. Never confessed to witchcraft or being the warlock. And he was finally burned alive at the stake. The typical punishment in those days. A short time later, in the 17th century, emerged one of the most famous cases of France. It was a woman, her name was Catherine Malvoisin, otherwise known as Lavoisin. She was a French fortune teller commissioned to poison and professional provider of sorcery. She was actually the head of a network of fortune tellers in Paris, and she was doing all kinds of stuff. She actually became pretty big and famous there and sought after. She developed an organization, like a commission, and they would perform black magic and poison. They would murder people. It's said that she murdered up to 1,000 people, some believe 2,500. The art of poisoning had become a regular science at the time. And she was at the top of the list. She was arrested March 12th, 1679, and she was put on trial. And she was, of course, convicted of witchcraft and sentenced to execution by burning 2 days later. In the days following her verdict until her execution, she was interrogated under torture. And of course, she begged for mercy, but to no avail. To no avail. Some of these tombstones you can't even read. This says babies. We are apparently standing probably in an area of several babies. So that witch, she was burned at the stake. She went up in a flaming pyre of fire, screaming in agony, as you could expect anyone would, as the flames consumed her. Let's skip ahead to, well, actually it was nearly the same time, here to America. We had the Salem witch trials. Everybody knows, has heard of the Salem witch trials, right? Warlocks, yeah, there were a couple. Giles Corey, George Jacobs. Let's talk about Giles. He was an English-born American farmer who was accused of witchcraft along with his wife Martha. It was during those Salem witch trials. He was kind of a mean guy. And, I mean, there was an earlier incident where he had beaten his servant, his indentured servant. Now, in the day, you could beat the heck out of your servants. You could even kill them, I guess. and you wouldn't be subject to anything maybe but a fine. So that's what happened to him. He had killed this man by beating him with a stick. His name was Jacob Goodale. And according to the witnesses, he was caught stealing apples from Corey's brother-in-law, so that's why he did it. He didn't let him have medical attention for 10 days, but then he let him see the doctor. It was too late. He died. Now, his third wife, Martha Corey, was arrested for witchcraft on March 19th, 1692. Of course, it was pandemonium there. A lot of people were being accused of witchcraft. Everybody was out of control, making stuff up. But she was arrested, and Corey ended up getting arrested too, accused of being a wizard or a warlock. And he denied the accusations. And the problem with him was that he would not declare guilty or not guilty. I mean, if it was me, I would have said not guilty and fought it, but he just would not. He was cantankerous, I guess. So they put him to what's called the press. And that's basically where they strip you naked and you lay you on the cold floor, concrete. They put boards on you and they put boulders on you until you can't take it anymore. And then they just keep piling it on. I've got to read to you. Let me get this out here. There was a quote which was really brutal about this. It had said, "The accused be put into a low dark chamber, and there be laid on his back on the bare floor, naked, unless when decency forbids, that there be placed upon his body as great a weight as he could bear, and more, that he hath no sustenance, save only on the first day 3 morsels of the worst bread, and the second day 3 draughts of standing water. That should be alternately his diet till he died or till he answered." And he went on. He basically went on for 3 days. And it is said that his tongue was coming out, and the sheriff took his cane and shoved the tongue back in. I mean, his internal organs were coming out, practically his mouth. And he would not give in. He's like, more weight, more weight. So they kept putting more weight on. And on the 3rd day, he finally succumbed. Can you imagine the brutality? Wow. So he died a horrible death. And then his wife, of course, she wasn't spared. Before he died, he said, "Damn you, I curse you and Salem." And it was his wife, Martha, interestingly, was hanged. She wasn't burnt. All the witches there were hanged, typically. She was hanged 3 days later on September 22nd, 1692. Well, let's go to the 18th century. Let's skip ahead to the 18th century. Let's go to Brazil. Let's go to Brazil. There was a woman named Ursulina de Jesus. She was an alleged Brazilian witch. She was married to a man named Sebastiano de Jesus in Sao Paulo. Now, her husband here had positioned himself in government, and he was a very important guy. And he accused her of witchcraft, and he said, "She prevented me from having children. She made me sterile by use of magic." Now, at the time, it was said he was having an affair with his mistress, Cesario. And She came and confirmed his testimony in court. Oh boy, you talk about unjust. Poor Ursulina de Jesus. She was found guilty of heresy by using witchcraft. So in 1754, she was executed by being burnt at the stake. She was surrounded by a small group of aristocrats who had the front row, backed up by a large jeering public crowd of peasants as she screamed for her life. Let me tell you something, gang. Fire, death by fire is the worst. Must be the worst. I've seen on YouTube, I wish I never watched it, but I think it was the terrorists that had burned the one man alive over there a decade or two ago. I can't remember. He was in a cage. I wish I never watched it. It's the worst. It has to be the worst death. The worst way to go. Now, as we approach the grave of the warlock, there's one thing that is interesting. And the grave is right up there. See that? That grave is oriented north-south. And as you look around here, all of the graves are either facing east, which is that way, or like these here, they're facing west. So, and the reason they do that is the Christians, they saw on the final day, the coming of Christ, Christ would come out of the east. So they want to be facing, all good Christians, east, or I guess west. But here I can see every single stone is oriented east-west, except for that one, right up there, which is his stone. We're going to talk about him. That is really eerie. That is really eerie, and it's all by itself up there, guys. Okay, well, let's walk over there, and let's look at these last 3 or 4 stones. Looks like there's 3 more, and I'll tell you one more story. Let's go back to Switzerland. Let's go to Switzerland just a little bit later in the 18th century. There was a woman there who was accused of being a witch. Her name was Anna Goldie, an 18th century Swiss woman. She was one of the last persons to be executed in Europe for witchcraft, which I find very interesting. That early would be the last person, but she's known as the last witch in Switzerland. She had arrived in Glarus, Switzerland in 1765. She was 31, and it is said she was impregnated by a mercenary, one who had left Switzerland before she gave birth. Her baby died the night it was born, something actually that wasn't uncommon, infant mortality. But for this, she was pilloried. Do you guys know what pillory is? It's that thing they stick your head and hands into. And she was sentenced to 6 years of house arrest. Well, it wasn't enough, because when she got out, she ended up working as a maid for a family in 1780, the Tschudi family. And Jacob Tschudi reported her. Maybe he knew her past, but he reported her for putting needles in the bread and milk of one of his daughters through supernatural means. So Goldie fled, and she did successfully escape. They advertised a reward to capture her. They finally tracked her down. They tortured her, and she admitted to entering a pact with the devil, who she said had appeared to her as a black dog. And she was sentenced to execution by decapitation. And What's crazy, guys, is I can go on and tell you so many stories, but what's crazy is it's still going on. There were 2 executions back in the last decade. I think it was Saudi Arabia. You can look it up. And there was one last year in Somalia, firing squad, a warlock they killed. So we're here at the grave of this man. We finally arrived here at the top corner of this hill. And the first thing I see is there's animal feces all over this monument. Look at that. What does that tell you? Boy, that's not a good sign. Well, his name was Robert Vaughn, and they said he was a warlock. And except for this, now it is said there were 3 candle holders on the top of this, and of course, you know, the Vandals. I'm going to actually don't want to look at that. Yeah, it's a little better. Now there were candles, there was a whole setup on here which has either been destroyed or removed. And it is said that if you lit the candles at night, and apparently people come here at night, that the candles would flare and they would turn different colors. Boy, that's creepy. That gate over there, there's hardly any wind, and it's like, I don't know if you heard that, but it is like opening and closing, man. It's really spooky. There's a little wind. Keeps doing that. But anyway, back to this man here. Yeah, they would come here at night and light those candles. Now there was an inscription here, and I don't see, oh here, Vaughn. There's the name. There's the name Vaughn. And it is facing to the north, of course. Why is that? Isn't that interesting? So it is said that there were also smaller stones that would line this where he was buried. Of course, they did that in the old days. They would outline so you wouldn't step on the grave. It's hard to know where he's buried. He could be on this side, he could be on this side. I'm guessing he's probably right here. But it's Robert Vaughn. We did some research on him. He was born in Wales in 1831, Deb found out, and he died, also Trish, in 1880. He was 48 or 49 years old. He was a miner for a while. In 1850 and 1870, he was listed as a farmer. And his wife was named Winnifred. And after he died here, she remarried. So I don't know. What do you guys think? There's a few strange things happening here. But the biggest thing was all the excrement on there. I mean, there's other small, short tombstones. Why did they? I don't know. You think he was a warlock? Or just a farmer? We'll probably never know, but catch you guys later. Be nice.